Please welcome to the stage, Linda Fletcher.
Hello. I have a message for you today. It was a dark and dreary day in September as I sat in my father's den. He had just passed, and I was about the grim business of cleaning out his desk. Suddenly, the clouds broke and the sun came bursting through the window over my shoulders and illuminated the back recesses of his middle desk drawer, allowing me to see an old and yellowed newspaper clipping that would forever change my life. It was a write-up about his having won the Silver Star for his bravery in Italy during World War II. As I read it, I was filled with questions and then flooded with a wave of grief as I realized those questions would never be answered. That grief was compounded when I further realized that his Silver Star wasn't the only thing that he'd not spoken of. In fact, he'd never said one word about any of his wartime experiences. And then all that grief was intensified with overwhelming shame as I connected with the worst part, and that is that I had never asked. But even then, I did not realize that my father had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, profound PTSD. Later, when I finally did connect the dots, so much of the past began to make sense. And 8 years ago, I vowed to learn more about him and PTSD, and so my quest began. I started my study with a review of the literature, and I studied sociology, spirituality, psychiatry, psychology, epidemiology, and history. I attended courses and conferences and lectures from sea to shining sea, and even abroad. My greatest source of information, however, came from conversations with hundreds of people. I spoke with people who had PTSD and with people who loved people who had PTSD. I also spoke with behavioral scientists and legislators and doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs and the guy who does my yard work. In the end, my quest took the form of an epidemiological study, and this should have been no surprise, as I spent the majority of my military career in the specialty of infection control, stamping out disease. Let me just give you a brief definition of epidemiology. It's the study of the origin, prevention, and control of diseases and injuries. I'd like to share with you some of the findings of my study, but before I do, I want to make sure you understand that PTSD is a stealthy invader, not only of our people, but also of our society. It is the elephant in our living room. It is the elephant in our living room, and the only way to conquer it is by illuminating the shadows with information leading to understanding. And let there be no doubt, there is much about PTSD that is misunderstood by the American public. Now let's have a look at some of my findings, beginning with the definition of PTSD. A brief medical definition is that PTSD is a prolonged response to a traumatic event. When I ask Americans what they think PTSD is, they say, I don't really know. And when I ask veterans with PTSD what they think it is, they reply to me in very simple words to try to tell me that there's something going on that is much deeper than just their physical symptoms. And they say to me, I'm not the same person I used to be. And that means I don't know who I am anymore. And they also say, I just want to come home. And that translates to, I don't fit here or belong here or anywhere else anymore. They have lost themselves, and they cannot reintegrate to their families or their communities. And this is their greatest pain. When I began this study, I wanted to know just how big this elephant is. And there are lots of numbers out there. But when we add the active cases still on the rolls from Vietnam, some 300,000, to the current and expected long-term totals from our recent wars, the number approaches 1 million. When I ask Americans how many cases of PTSD they think we're going to be dealing with, I get the same answer. You know, I don't really know. But the problem is much bigger than this. Veterans with PTSD sometimes behave in ways that inflict injury, physical or psychological injuries on their families. These collateral injuries are huge and growing, and their impact is untold. Now let's talk about what it feels like to have PTSD, what the symptoms are, and how they're manifested in behaviors. Our veterans usually suffer from multiple stress-related symptoms simultaneously and for years. But the signature symptom of PTSD is hypervigilance. Think of that as stress on steroids. Here's how it works. I want you to remember the last time you had the wits scared out of you, when every single cell in your body was on high alert. You got it? Well, that's where veterans with PTSD live 24/7, because that response gets stuck in the on position and they can't turn it off. Well, you can imagine that insomnia is an issue. And now I want you to imagine being sleep deprived and on high alert every day, every night, every moment of your life. You think you might be grumpy? Well, combine that with the feeling that you just don't belong anywhere anymore. This combination results in behaviors that keep our jails full of veterans, and their unemployment and homelessness issues are well documented. By virtue of their huge numbers, PTSD is warping the very fabric of our society, and the projected future dollar costs are, you don't even want to know. Just know this: the elephant is creeping into our society, as well as into your pocketbook, a lot. And there's another behavior I want to tell you about. It's the final surrender of those who were actually killed on the battlefields, but who came home to die after much suffering and by their own hands. Suicide. In 2012, Americans were shocked to learn that we lose a veteran to suicide every 65 minutes. That's some 8,030 per year. But I'm here to tell you that number is incorrect. It falls short of the mark a lot. I personally reviewed the document. For this information, and I can tell you that only 17, that's 34% of our 50 states, reported. What that means is that the total annual number was closer to 24,000. And folks, that equates to a veteran suicide almost every 20 minutes. So, let's face it, what we have here is an epidemic. By definition, an epidemic is an increase in the incidence of an illness or an injury. That means we have an epidemic of PTSD every time we have a major conflict. So the question is, who's managing these? Well, the VA is responsible for treating PTSD, but they don't have any expertise in epidemiology, and they don't do epidemics. The agency in this land that is responsible for epidemics is the CDC, but they have never been tapped to address PTSD. So, to summarize that whole scenario, let me just say this. Knock, knock. Nobody. So now let's look at treatment. Americans believe that our usual aggressive approach to science and medicine has been applied to PTSD. Not so much. I took a look at our treatment regimens back as far as World War I. That's 100 years. And what I found is little change. Our treatment objective is and has been to teach veterans how to get through their days and nights by teaching them how to manage their symptoms. For instance, we teach them how not to jump under a table in a restaurant when they hear a loud noise. And in the early 80s, we brought another new symptom management tool to the fore, psychiatric drugs. And we created a pill for every symptom. In a century of treating PTSD, we have rarely even contemplated cause. Einstein said, the definition of insanity is to take the same action over and again and expect a different result. Perhaps it's time to change our broaden our treatment target to include the management of cause as well as management of symptoms. If we do that, though, we probably need to relook our whole concept of PTSD. I would like to address that with you. There's some new stuff to talk about. In 2013, David Wood, a reporter, brought great clarity to the subject when he dissected PTSD into two overlapping comorbid conditions, physical injury and moral injury. This allowed us to view PTSD as two separate issues instead of the tangled mass of symptoms that it always had been. The physical realm is self-explanatory and has received a lot of attention. The gist of moral injury is that sometimes during the course of executing our soldierly duties, we are required to do things that violate our own moral codes. For example, most of us believe, "Thou shalt not kill." And when we do, sometimes severe inner conflict results, and we don't really recognize who we are anymore because we change inside. I've spoken to many veterans about their moral injuries. One said to me, "When I saw the face of the first person I ever killed, I felt every ounce of goodness in my body lift up and leave, never to return. Along those lines, we have failed to recognize the spiritual component to PTSD. There are many behavioral scientists who believe it is primarily a spiritual component. My research indicates that it is a spiritual component as well as a moral component. And both of those target the center of our being. As a result, I think this should be called core injury. The question of the day is, now what? Well, I think the next step is to harness the power of the elephant and make it work for us. I'd like to share a few thoughts that I have that might help transform this sneaky beast. First, our PTSD treatment is reminiscent of the palliative care that we provide our terminally ill. We fail to treat cause. We only try to make the symptoms more tolerable. The question here is why? Why are we not recognizing the spiritual and moral components? And why are we not aggressively seeking new thought and embracing the wisdom of the ages that's available to us through alternative care methodologies ranging from acupuncture to Zen meditation? And why has the behavioral science community, led by psychiatry, opted to remain in a 100-year-old treatment rut? Let there be no doubt our veterans with PTSD are subject to a higher incidence of suicide, but we need to stop treating them as if there is no hope for repair. Next, the CDC, which is a part of the U.S. Public Health Service, uses a standardized medical model to manage epidemics. Applying this model to PTSD, which is a major public health issue, could have dramatic results. First, the public would be barraged with information, basic and correct information about PTSD. And wouldn't it be wonderful if Americans knew as much about PTSD as we do about the Ebola and childhood obesity epidemics? But more importantly, the CDC, if involved, would follow the medical model to identify the origin of those suicides, most probably core injury, and the next step would then be to seek better treatment options to contain it. In short, if we hope to get out of this treatment rut, we need to ask for the help of the CDC. But wait. There may be another way out there to help us eat this elephant. Perhaps we have been too reliant just on medicine. Brené Brown, of TED Talks fame, says, "Me too" are the two most healing words in the English language. And Jonathan Shea, world-renowned expert on PTSD and my personal hero, says it's peers, peers, peers who do the heavy lifting for each other. The rest of us are just there to sweep out the gum wrappers. These comments let me define and study a non-medical support group of combat veterans in New York, Combat Vets Anonymous. I was honored by the invitation to attend one of their meetings, and I saw their loving support web in action. There was a young guy in the circle who was weeping from the start. Soon he bolted from the room, sobbing uncontrollably. No one moved. A few minutes later, one of the guys said, "Who's taking care of John tonight?" Suddenly, 2 hands lifted up, and a third one came up and he said, "I'll cover him tomorrow." Because they had all walked in the moccasins, they knew how to help. They provided the space, the safety, and the support to allow him to deal with his issues. They all know repairing from PTSD is an inside job. These guys unanimously agree that this peer group is a more powerful and productive tool than anything that they have experienced through the VA systems. And I believe this non-medical option holds huge potential to become a major tool that will help warriors heal themselves. On a personal note, I had no way of knowing that ray of sunshine that led me to that old newspaper clipping would launch a journey of any sort, let alone one of the magnitude that this has been. As I ventured forth, trying to make amends for not having understood my father's plight, I discovered a huge rip in the heart of America. I had no idea how big and stealthy PTSD was, or how far-reaching are its tentacles, or how little Americans know about this problem. Along the way, I found another injured heart, my own. Because of this journey, I have discovered my own buried and forgotten military-related PTSD, as well as my own deep collateral injury imparted by my father's PTSD. In the end, what I know for sure, not only from my research, but from my up-close and personal perspective, is that repairing this stuff is an inside job. It's been an honor and a privilege to address you today. Peace. And may God bless America.